Hello, everyone. So today I wanted to talk about the Battle of Maldon, specifically sort of the battle itself and the poem of the same name, which is about the battle. And I wanted to talk about it largely because I can. During the so-called Dark Ages, we don't have as much information on battles as we did in the ancient world, where we have figures like Caesar recording his own battles and sort of giving us a play-by-play of what's going on, and other historians writing about earlier campaigns. This isn't something we really see in the post-Roman world for quite some time. So during this early medieval period, we don't have a lot of battles we can really talk about in a very definitive way. And even when we do have literature about battles, it's often something like the Godothan, which records it more as recording the heroic actions of individual figures in the battle rather than describing how the battle itself played out. So the Battle of Maldon is pretty unique in this regard, so that we can talk about it in this way. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. So I'm going to start with a quick summary of the battle and then get into a bit of discussion. So the battle is between a force of Anglo-Saxons, who I've represented in red, and Vikings, who I've represented in gray. There's no reason behind that color choice. I just wanted colors that will stand out against the backgrounds. At the start of the poem, they're sort of arranged on opposite sides of this river. We're told that the Vikings are already there when the Saxons show up. And while it seems a decent portion, at least, of the Saxon army comes on horseback, they then dismount in preparation for the battle. So they don't actually fight as cavalry, despite having at least a decent portion of the army, it seems, on horses. And also during this very early stages of preparation, we're told that Earl Bryhtnoth, who is the commander of the Anglo-Saxons and sort of the hero of the poem, taught the warriors how they had to stand and hold position, and bade that they hold their shields aright fastly in their hands and fear not. Which sounds again sort of like arranging the army. He's teaching them where to stand, but it also says he specifically teaches them how to hold their shields. So it seems like he's not just taking this army, but he's actually raised sort of the levy troops. The fjord in Anglo-Saxon terms is sort of the technical term. But seems that the vast majority of his army aren't trained hardened warriors, but in fact a sort of peasant levy, not professional soldiers. Also, I've sort of represented them on just opposite sides of this river with different interpretations. We'll position it slightly differently. So, for instance, there's a fairly common you'll read in secondary sources about the Vikings actually sort of being on an island in the river, or an island slightly off the shore. And the poem itself doesn't really get into that much detail, just sort of that there's this river dividing between them. So I've just simply represented it as just this river between the two armies. It doesn't really matter much because in the grand scheme of things, this river sort of gets ignored in the battle. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention that not every interpretation of the battle will have just a simple river running through and the two armies on opposite sides. So we're told that while this river divides them, at certain times at low tide, a sort of causeway will open up, sort of a natural fording point, which will allow the armies to reach each other. So in preparation for this, Bryhtnoth sends a small contingent of people that seem to be more elite fighting forces. They aren't just the peasants anymore. This smaller contingent seems to be sort of the professional soldiers of the army. The Thanes, we might, if we sort of speculate a bit more on their rank. The hard and fast troops are sent to hold the causeway against the Vikings. My translation does use the word Vikings, although perhaps we might want to call them Danes or Norse, since Viking isn't a particularly common phrase during this period. I think the translator might be taking a bit of liberty here. So Bryhtnoth sends his his hardened warriors to go and hold the bridge and sort of prevent the Vikings from coming over here when it seems that battle is going to be imminent. But the Vikings sort of refuse to advance down this narrow causeway against his hardened soldiers, and instead they have a bit of negotiations. And Bryhtnoth allows the Viking army to cross over uncontested and form a sort of more regular battle line on his side of the river. And this is something that's hotly contested, or not contested, but criticized. Even the poem itself seems to criticize Bryhtnoth for allowing the Norse to do this. It seems that it sort of criticizes him as overconfident and things like that. Like, this is obviously a tactical error. Why are you letting the enemies sort of do something like cross through this narrow fording point that's easy to defend when you could try when you could not do that. And this is something that a lot of even modern sources tend to agree with the author of the poem on this, that it was an oversight on Bryhtnoth's part to allow the Norse to cross over to his side of the river. And part of that is simple hindsight, because once the Vikings do cross over, and we have two battle lines on the same side of the river, rather, and they get to the clash, and the Vikings win handily. Bryhtnoth himself is slain in the battle, and it's a bit of a disaster. And this sort of leads to the payments of the Danegeld, of sort of paying off the Vikings not to attack the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because after this they don't really have an army to defend themselves. So they could just sort of have free reign to keep raiding. So a lot of the criticism is that the Earl Bryhtnoth shouldn't have allowed the Vikings to do this. He should have done something else. So that's sort of the discussion I want to get into. Is while I sort of agree in hindsight it's a bit of a terrible decision, I think we're sort of being overcritical of Bryhtnoth. And I think that really what he did was a bit of a smart move. Maybe not the smartest move, but it's definitely not dumb. And I think there's more ways to see it than just this overconfidence and an over-eagerness for battle. And I think sort of an important point in this discussion is this wasn't his ideal plan. He wanted to have his hardened soldiers, his better grade troops, if we will, to just hold it in this narrow choke point against the Viking army. That was his sort of ideal plan. It just didn't work, because if you think about it, that is sort of the best strategy in the situation. But again, he can't control what the Vikings do. He can't force them to advance against his easily defended position. So he could have just simply held it out like a siege, but then if high tide returns and they can use their boats to flee, or if they do have more land on their side of the river, they can just wander back. Then the Vikings will just leave. There's no battle, but they are they're raiders. They're not necessarily coming in to conquer, and all that's really doing is allowing the army to come back at a later date after the Anglo-Saxon army has gone back. The peasant levy has been released back to the villages to come and just attempt to raid uncontested at a different time. I mean, it sort of fulfills the short-term objective of preventing this raid, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. It's just kicking it down to a later date. So again, we could interpret this as a bit of overconfidence, trying to fight the battle at this time, or that he's eager to get that glory of defeating the Vikings at this battle. But really, we could also interpret it as a bit more of a long-term strategy. If you're going to have to fight the Vikings, if this army is going to have to be dealt with eventually, why not do it now when you already have the levy raised? And the peasants do have rights. You can't just constantly call them up again and again. Once you release them, they only owe you a certain amount of military service a year. So it's not a good strategy in the long term to raise the army, stop a raid, and then melt them back, and raise them again, and then not fight them, and then raise them a third time. If you keep doing this, eventually you will run out of the ability to call your peasant levies. So you want to use them sort of as quickly as you can once the levy has been raised. So it could also be a strategy. We have the troops here, we have the enemy here. We should fight them now. We need to fight them now. Because if we keep pushing it off it's going to eventually put us at this disadvantage. So if you're the commander and you decided that you want to fight this battle today, you want to fight it now, which again you could argue isn't the best option, but I'm just saying it's not as necessarily as bad a decision as the poem and certain historians seem to paint it. This could easily be considered a good strategic move rather than just overconfidence or overeagerness to fight this battle. So you had the strategy to defend the strong point with your elite troops. And this strategy doesn't seem to be working. The Norse aren't taking the bait and aren't advancing. But they are saying that they will come to your side to fight the battle. And or they're willing to, and through the negotiations, they're saying they will allow themselves to do that. And that's sort of the best option. Because again, assuming you don't have a way to force them into advancing upon you, which seems likely, the poem does specifically say they're too far to have effective range. They can't reach each other with their javelins, and they're sort of maybe at the maximum of stent of bows. It would be sort of indirect and ineffective fire. So you can't bait them into charging with your ranged troops, and they don't seem to be willing to just go in just for the heck of it. So you can't force them into your sort of ideal plan of holding the bridge in that way, or holding the causeway in that way. So instead you sort of have two different theories. One, you could let them you could accept their negotiations, let them cross over to your side of the river, and then fight them in what would be a more standard land battle. Just sort of infantry on infantry, shield walls colliding, which is what happened and led to the defeat of the Anglo-Saxon army. Really, your only other strategy, assuming, again, you do want to have this battle today, which seems to be a good strategic move if you're relying this much on your levy troops. If they're the core of your army, and again, everything's set up, it's a decent day to have the battle, let's just get this over with. So you want to have this battle today, and you can't get them to advance on you. You sort of have two options. You can either let them cross over as they want to, or your only other option is to try to advance on their side of the river, which is worse for you, because now you still have to fight at this choke point, but now you're the ones wading through the river, and they can use their elite troops to just hold that and sort of let their less experienced, sort of less capable fighters sort of hang by the back, basically giving them all the advantage you were trying to gain in your initial strategy. And that's definitely the worst option. So I think, given what we know, that he did try to use this better tactically thought out strategy first, of being able to hold the fording point with his elite troops, that he did have a decent amount of strategy going into this. And so I think it's likely that rather than only being overconfidence or only being overeagerness, which might have played a part in it, that his willingness to let the Norse troops onto the Anglo-Saxon side of the river and allowing them to fight this more evenly matched battle was actually a good strategic point, because sort of the other option, since they weren't taking the bait and advancing on your position, the only other option was to give them all of the advantages that you would have had by basically advancing on their strongly defensive position. So obviously, in hindsight, we can tell this is a bit of a bad idea, and this might not necessarily be the best option. But I think once you sort of take a different look at the overall strategic considerations that someone like Bryhtnoth would have had during this battle, or in the preparation of this battle, that I think allowing the Norse army onto the Anglo-Saxon side of the river might actually have been a pretty well thought out and good strategic move that just didn't work out in the long term. So that's what I think. I think we might be being a little bit too harsh in our criticism of Bryhtnoth and sort of the poem in the same way as being a bit too harsh. And that really we should think of Bryhtnoth as a bit of a good strategist that just didn't happen to win the battle. So I'd like to hear your opinions on this as well. So if you want to leave a comment, that'd be great. But otherwise, signing off.